Hey guys, this will be my video on how to install a Koolance VID NX N2 water block onto a GeForce GTX 780 Ti. So this water block is from Koolance, and it is a revision of an earlier model they had that was only designed for the GTX 780 and the Titan. This new model can fit the 780 Ti as well as the Titan Black edition. So the card I have is the EVGA superclocked 780 Ti with the ACX cooler on it. So this is it's a reference design PCB, but the cooler is obviously not reference design. But other than that, it'll still fit water blocks just as the reference card will. So the first step is to remove the stock cooler from the card. You do this by removing the screws from the underside of the card, and this cooler is pretty easy to get off. So we'll start unscrewing these, and I'll show you how it comes off. So I'm starting with the actual GPU screws. There's 4 of them. And then we'll do the other smaller screws. So you want to make sure you find all the screws and unscrew them until you, or before you try to remove the cooler. On this particular model for from EVGA, there's no screws on the I/O on the front of the I/O panel, but there is one in the corner, which is right here. This one will be replacing with a special washer, or excuse me, with a special nut once we remove the cooler. So that should be all of them. Okay. We'll now remove the cooler from the PCB. Now this cooler has one header for the fans, so we will remove that. There we go. You can see this card from EVGA has a special additional heat sink. This black metal piece here, which is on the card, I don't believe this is I believe this is different than the reference design. However, it's still a reference board because you can see the LED header right here, and this cooler obviously doesn't have LEDs on it, so there wouldn't be a need for that. But it is a reference design board. This heat spreader, this is what is touching the video RAM modules as well as other components, and it's actually not screwed on. It's simply stuck to the PCB with the thermal pads, so you can slowly twist it from side to side and it will eventually come off. So you can see the thermal pads. This is the only thing that's keeping this piece on the board, so it simply pulls off. And here we have the video card. So next, before we continue, we're going to put some of these screws back into the cooler so we don't lose them. So the next step will be removing the stock thermal compound from the GPU. To do that, we use some rubbing alcohol and toilet paper. Once you're finished with the rubbing alcohol, you want to take a microfiber towel or a shirt, something that's non-fibrous, and wipe down the GPU to dry out any leftover alcohol and clean it off. In addition to the cloth, I take some canned air and just go over it one more time to make sure there's nothing left on the GPU. In addition to the GPU, you also want to take some alcohol and wipe down the RAM modules, because I don't know if you'll be able to see or not, but they have some residue on them from the stock thermal pads. So we'll wipe off that residue so that the new thermal pads can make good contact. So the next step will be installing the new thermal pads onto the water block. So we'll set the card out of the way. Now this water block came with one sheet of thermal pad, which you will have to cut to size, and you can check the instruction manual. It'll show you the locations of the thermal pads. There's 6 locations on the actual block, 3 large strips, 3 small strips, and then this back plate also takes 3 large strips of thermal pad. So we'll take our scissors and our thermal pad square, and we'll measure out the size. It doesn't need to be exact, but we don't want to waste any thermal pad. Okay, so we have our thermal pads on. The next step will be to apply the thermal paste to the GPU and then put the block on. So this water block came with thermal paste, but it doesn't look too good, so I'm going to use some aftermarket. This is IC Diamond 24 karat thermal paste, and I'm going to put about the size of a pea onto the GPU. The next step will be to place the water block upside down onto a raised surface. We raise the surface like this so that the I/O side of the graphics card can hang off as we put the card down onto the water block. So we line it up. And we push it down. Now, I'm not going to lift up the PCB and check the spread of the thermal compound because I know I put enough, and the thickness of the thermal pads is designed specifically for this card, so I'm not going to check the imprints on the thermal pads. It's recommended by IC Diamond to not check the spread of the thermal compound after you put the block down onto it because it can introduce air into the joint. So once that thermal compound gets smushed in between the GPU and the block, we'll leave it sit so it's a good seal. Next, we'll take the back plate and set it onto the back of the PCB, because all of the screws for this block go through the back plate, through the PCB, and then into the block. Now, this is a discrepancy with this particular block. The package came with a set of screws that actually says for GTX 780 Ti. However, these screws are too short in this package. They're extremely short. They look like they would go through the PCB and into the water block, maybe without the use of the backplate, but this card is designed, or this block is designed to be used with the backplate, so I don't know why these screws are included with the system. Another bag has these longer screws, which are long enough to go through the backplate, through the PCB, and into the block. So we will use these longer screws. There's washers included with this kit. However, I'm not going to use the washers because they're like brown, so they're pretty ugly. But we will start putting these screws. There's 11 of them in total into the back of the back plate. We will tighten them down loosely at first, starting with the 4 screws around the GPU, and then tightening them down in a star pattern once all of them have made contact with the block. The last thing we will do is add the last screw, which connects the PCB back to the I/O panel. Originally, the screw went through and into the stock heat sink. That, of course, there's nothing here now in this corner. So the water block comes with a shorter screw and a nut to be used underneath the PCB where the old cooler used to be. And there you have it. That completes the installation of this water block onto a 780 Ti graphics card from EVGA. The next step will be connecting this card to my other card using two SLI bridge connectors from Koolance.